Okay, here we go. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's nice to see you all here. Yeah, we're finishing off 2017. So I want to talk about integral spirituality today, and it's a fairly big subject, so I'm going to try to bring it down to earth. Obviously, when we speak about integral stuff, we're referring in many ways to Ken Wilber's writings, and he has written about this most of his life. But I think what we're really talking about is integration. Now, you remember, if you've taken the primers, in the very first primer course, we say integration and well-being are synonymous. When we are integrated, we are well. And we even use a metaphor and a little map of the river. Remember the river of life? That when you're in the river of life and you're integrated, your life is flowing. There's a forward movement in your life when you're integrated. You get up in the morning and you have a energy in your step and you want to go to work and you can't wait to, yeah? And we also speak about that a little bit more psychologically as a window of tolerance, so that we say that if you sit meditation and you practice mindfulness, it can help you be more resilient, because you start to build a broader, wider window of tolerance for experiences that you have difficulty with. If you have a lot of anxiety, then if you sit meditation and you sit with that anxiety and practice mindfulness, you can learn to have a wider window of tolerance for the anxiety, so that when it arises, instead of acting out and going into chaos or contracting and getting rigid, you can stay in the middle of that river, so to speak, in a place that's integrated and move through the anxiety more effectively, more skillfully. That's a principle of integration. And what I think when I speak about integral, I'm just simply speaking about the need to bring that principle into a larger context of our spiritual path, because we live in a complicated world, and our spiritual path needs to be able to match what the complexities that are going on in our world in order to be, so that we can be integrated. So that first principle that we teach in the primers is great. I just don't think it goes far enough. So let's think about these words we use. We just did a service this morning, and we chanted the identity of relative and absolute. Does anyone really know what those two words mean? Yeah, I realized the absolute yesterday, and I'm going to work today, and I'm in the relative world. Hey, do we really think about those words as applying to our lives? But if I use the word sameness and difference, you could get that right away, couldn't you? We like sameness. It gives us stability. It's predictable. In many ways, we like meditation because it brings a kind of groundedness to our lives, and that aspect of our experience where there's sameness, we feel safer. It's kind of the status quo. It's familiar. But, we also have differences in our lives, don't we? And those can be both exhilarating and they can be scary. That's where we grow, is actually with the differences, when things get disrupted. And let me just really say this so you can all relate to it. We move through sameness and difference all the time in our daily life, in the lives that we're living. Think of when you were an 8-year-old growing up, and you were in your family, and if you had a relatively good family, you thought of your father kind of as a hero and your mother as a saint. Didn't you? You were in your family. You were your family. When you were 8 years old, what, Ben, was that so? But the point is, when you were 8 years old, you did identify with your family. You were your family. Yeah? And it was a good thing. It was like you might have been proud of your family and thought, this is the best, my family's the best ever, whatever. And then what happens? You get a little, okay, no, some of you, I realize that doesn't work for everyone, but, that's the point. We're a very diverse culture. You can't say any generalization. It doesn't apply to everyone. But then you got to your teenagers, your early teens, and what happened? That's right, man. Now there's difference. Now all of a sudden you're not your family. And it's pretty clear you don't want to be your family, right? When I was a teenager, I played Bob Dylan as loud as I could to torture my mother. That was my job as a teenager. You are different. When you're a teenager, part of being a teenager is you start to see, well, no, I do not fit in my family anymore. I don't want to fit in my family anymore.
You must be adopted.
Huh?
You must be adopted.
Okay, and so that's difference. And that's where we grow. We grow up as teenagers. We start to find our way in the world. It's absolutely necessary to have difference, to differentiate from your family. No, I'm not my family. I'm me. I'm an individual. I have my own dreams and desires and whatever. So you differentiate, and that's how you find your way in the world. And then if you're lucky, usually now I lost my parents in my early 20s, so this got a little delayed for me. It actually happened later. But I think when you get in your 20s and 30s, you start to look back on your family, and you start to notice that there are parts of you that are a lot like your parents, whether you like them or not. Now, I was very judgmental of my father because he was a businessman, and I was kind of artistic, so I was in the kind of new age, new paradigm. He was business, and that was bad. And I was artist and feelings and holistic, and that was good. Bad paradigm is linear, rational, science. Left brain. Good paradigm is right brain, feelings, embodied, holistic, eco-centered. I was in the good paradigm.
Me too.
Yeah. And so, you notice how black and white that is. I mean, if that's your map of the world, that's pretty dualistic. So you get to your young adult stage and you start to look back and you actually start to reintegrate into your family, don't you? But it's a more complex identity you have now. You're not totally identified with your family, 100%. You have your individuality, but you also come back to your family and say, there's a lot of things you gave me and I appreciate about my parents, both of them. So you have a more complex identity as you grow into adulthood. And that process of sameness and difference goes on throughout our lives. It goes on in the spiritual path as well. And really what I want to talk about is that movement of difference and sameness. And I think that's really important. We live in a very complex, globalized world now with a lot of diversity and plurality. And we have enormous problems. I won't attempt to list them all because we'll just get depressed. But we have enormous problems, and we're so diverse we can't even agree on what the problems are. So how would we possibly find a solution? So solving these problems isn't just going to be a technological fix. It actually has something to do with our moral and our ethical norms, behavior, what we agree on as moral. And the Dalai Lama has said, the world is too diverse now for any one religion to say what that would be. We need a secular ethics. And so we need so we need to ensure an ethics that is non-dual, that sees no ontological gap between things, that has no metaphysical boundary between what is and what is not. When we divide the world in that way, we create suffering, turmoil, and trouble. We need an ethics that can, where we can come together and we can celebrate our differences. So non-duality is not some kind of bland sameness. Not at all. It's actually acknowledging our differences so we can make a difference. It's acknowledging and celebrating diversity. So, integral theory and practice is quite large. If you've read any of Ken Wilber's books, you know what I'm talking about. He's not always easy to read. And I'm kind of reluctant to talk about theory here, but that's kind of in the bad paradigm anyway, so you're not supposed to do that. You shouldn't do that.
Easy to dismiss.
But you know what? We need maps. Before we had maps that we're familiar with, people used to go across the oceans with the world as their map. I mean, they looked up and they see the stars, and the Hawaiians, they would travel great distances in the ocean, and they knew the currents and the fish and the wind, and they read all that. That was their map. And they actually negotiated going vast distances in the Pacific without getting lost. Amazing. That was their map. That's not our map anymore. Well, you remember the days when we had paper maps?
Yes.
Yeah, you're going on a vacation and you say, let's go to the gas station and buy a map for this wherever we are. And then you get the map out and you try to find out where you are on the map. Let's see, I think we're there. There's an E and a 1, and you look up the index and you find it there. And then we want to go there, and then you have to get out your ruler and measure the distance. How long is that going to take? We had those maps, and now we have GPS, which has saved my relationship with Sensei many times over when she's navigating, because now we no longer have fights, or arguments. Because no, you missed it completely. The GPS. I can't fight with the GPS. The voice. She's too reasonable, and she just she does get lost occasionally. Yeah. So not foolproof, but we need maps, and we also need maps in a spiritual path. Now think about Buddhism, because that's what we're familiar with. One map is the right view. The first eightfold path, right view, is a kind of map. It's a kind of cognitive map. It tells you what you need to pay attention to so that you don't get lost on the path, on the eightfold path. It says you need to pay attention to karma. That's important. Consequences are important. And then they give you a list of wholesome and unwholesome behavior so that you can differentiate what is wholesome and what is not. Basically, it's a teaching about morality, isn't it? Precepts. It's a map that's saying if you want to be on a spiritual path, on this path, you need to learn about the consequences of your behavior. You need to, and we're going to give you a little map about that so that you know how to behave, because if you don't behave this way, things aren't going to go well later on. That's a kind of map. And what I think we need now is not only that map, but that's a very, that was a map that was created 2,500 years ago. Maybe the map needs to be upgraded just a little bit. We don't need to throw anything out. But let's add little things to the map. And I think integral theory could be added to the map. And that would be very helpful. And essentially, what I mean by that is some kind of education about what are states and what are stages and how are they different. So that there's no way to talk about this without first talking about it a bit abstractly and theoretically. But the beautiful thing about this is if we get this map and then we can apply it and practice it, then we have a common language by which we can talk to others that are really different from us across religious boundaries. And that's a great, not a small thing. Generally, interfaith dialogues that I've been in get kind of bogged down because there tends to be a little baggage that comes with each religion. We all have a little baggage, a meta story or a story from the good book, the right book. And then that gets in the way. But if you have a kind of language like Integral could give us, we have a way to talk about what's important in a kind of neutral way that we can all agree on. Because the amazing thing is if you look at the states from a point of view of integral theory and practice, and you look at states, they're pretty much the same across the board in all major religions. And all major religions have something to say about these states, which another way of saying it is spirit. All wisdom traditions are speaking about spirit. And it's really important. That's pretty much what we are always practicing about here at the Zen Center. It's about spirit. We can call it big mind, we can call it the absolute, you can call it Kensho, Satori, enlightenment. Doesn't matter what you call it. What does matter is that it is given and it is what is here. It doesn't change. And you can have this enlightenment experience today, and it's the same experience that someone had 2,000 years ago. That doesn't change. What does change are the stages we grow through. We now know, only in the last about 100 years, that there are very clearly established developmental stages psychologically, socially, that we move through from the time that we're a baby all the way through adulthood. And these are very well established. And these stages, I don't want to get too deep into stages, but I need to say something about them. So the first three stages are egotistical and narcissistic. Just as one example, archaic, the first stage of archaic is a one-year-old is the state of fusion. A one-year-old has no ego boundary at all. It's just fused. It has no differentiation between self and other. So that's the archaic stage. And we all have to go through that because we're all 1 year old when we first came into this world. We all have to move through. You can't skip stages. You have to move through each one. And because we are evolving and changing, we're always going to be moving through a newer stage that's responding to what's happening in our culture at the present time. So we have these first three stages. Then we have ethnocentric, which is a big shift from the first three. In the first three stages, you're not able to empathize with other at all. In the third stage, which is called mythic magical, there's a lot of emphasis. The real meat in that stage is it's all about power. And you find corrupt criminal enterprises often residing in this stage, mafias, corrupt governments. I won't name any names, but people that can't empathize with others. And laws don't matter to them. They make their own laws. What matters is winning. It's like really cut and tooth. That's not the right word. Claw and tooth? What is it?
Cut and dry?
No. Claw and... No, anyway, it's another word. But, yeah, something like that. You know, it's a race to the bottom. It's a zero-sum game. It's about winning. And you win any way you can. And I make my own rules. Power is what's important. So that's first three stages. And then there's a huge shift into the next stage, which we call ethnocentric, which is all about now you can actually empathize with others. Your family, your group, your tribe is what's important, and conforming to that group is absolutely important. Loyalty to the group. You will probably tend to have a fundamentalist type religious outlook. You will probably like your guns because you feel a little threatened by others outside of your group, so you need guns to protect yourself. But you will have some you could have some really deep core values about loyalty and patriotism, and you might be willing to die for those values as well. That's no small thing. The next stage that develops after that, we say, is world-centric, which is scientific rational reasoning. That's a big stage that happened with the Enlightenment, and that developed in about a short period of 100 years. And a lot of good things came from the Enlightenment. We got women's suffrage, freedom from slavery. We got the French Revolution and the American Revolution. We got representational democracy. Those are all good things, even though, notice that it's kind of in the bad paradigm. From the New Age, New Left kind of point of view. I can speak about this because I once was a part of that New Age in the 60s. And I totally embraced that good paradigm, the right paradigm. So science is rational. It's about success, merit-based, reason. And then you have the next stage that developed really in the 60s, which is pluralistic, multi-world centric, where now the emphasis is on really fighting for the underdog, the marginalized, diversity, really seeing the need for justice for everyone. It's very egalitarian. In this stage, you don't judge anyone. You're not supposed to have rank or hierarchy. That's bad too. And you shouldn't judge, but notice that's already a judgment. So there's a contradiction there in that stage. These middle three stages, ethnocentric, world-centric, and multi-world-centric, are really where most of the population resides at the present time. And notice that those three are where the cultural wars are taking place right now. Big time. And each one of these stages, when you're in it, you think you got the right way. You know that saying, I made a mistake, but I realized I was wrong. That's how you feel in any of these stages. If you're at the pluralistic stage, you think everyone should be pluralistic. What's the matter with those people, those people that like their guns and the Bible? There's something the matter with them. They don't really fight for justice. They're talking about the wall and immigration, and the culture wars are taking place in these. It might be helpful to understand where people are, what their worldview is, and how they come to it. And people, you cannot argue someone out of their worldview. You can't say your worldview is not good enough. Mine is better, and you should listen to me, and then you'll know how to have a better worldview. You can't. That doesn't work. People move through stages slowly. And the thing that's important about this is that, first of all, if you're progressive, you're probably in the kind of pluralistic stage, and you probably may feel a little uncomfortable with me talking about stages and ranking and nested hierarchies. But there we have it. Okay, so why is this important? 2,000 years ago, they didn't know about these stages. As I said, this is recent, maybe 100 years. In the last 100 years, we've gotten much more information and clarity about what these stages are. A lot of clinical information to validate these stages. So someone 2,000 years ago knew all about spirit. They knew nothing about stages. And the thing about stages is you could sit meditation till the cows come home and you'll never know about the stage that you're in. Because the stage that you are in is your subjective experience and you can't see it. The only way you can see your stage is if you have a map that says there's stages and now you try to find where you fit. Now you can start to notice, oh, I resonate with that stage. And now there is a practice for moving from that stage to the next, which is you begin to see your subjective experience as an object, which is essentially what we do with mindfulness. You are watching your subjective experience, and when you do that, you can start to disidentify with it. De-identify with it, what's the word? Yeah, you start to have a little distance from it, and when you do that, you organically start to move into the next stage because you're part of evolution, and this is how evolution works. You transcend the stage you're in and include it and move to the next. But you include it. You have to move through all these stages. Okay, so that's stages, and now we have spirit. In the Zen tradition, we don't use the word spirit. We use other words usually. And we also don't talk about it very much. It's an intuitive thing, and we really value a kind of non-conceptual awareness. Intuitive, and we have stories and koans that we work on. But all the teachings in our tradition are about spirit. Almost all of them are about this spirit. And I think it's helpful to be able to unpack this a little bit and speak about it in a way and notice that other traditions also are teaching about spirit. They use different names, but it's the same, it's actually the same experience. There's a lot of, and I think what's useful about this is that words that we use in our own tradition, we use them so often that they become ubiquitous and they kind of lose their freshness. So we use that word absolute and relative all the time. At least I'm guilty of using it a lot. If you've been in Dogsong with me, you know I've used it a lot. There's the absolute and there's the relative. There's big mind. We can facilitate that experience. And there's relative voices. Well, or even the word compassion, we use it so much it becomes ubiquitous. So we need ways to come at these, because these words are important. They're pointing at an aspect of our human experience, which is really important. So, from an integral perspective, we could talk about the absolute in a way that other traditions could also understand it, and a way that might help us make it more accessible to us. So there are different ways. Usually there are about 5 states. Sometimes there's 6 or 4, but it doesn't vary, give or take 1 or 2. It's usually around 5. And it can be simplified to 3. In our tradition, the 3 that we use are the 3 kayas, the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. That is from our tradition, that covers the whole range of spirit. Dharmakaya is enlightenment. Dharmakaya is totality. Dharmakaya is a non-conceptual, non-dual awareness where there is no division at all between you and the world. Sometimes we speak of this as emptiness. And then the Sambhogakaya is the subtle realm, where we're dealing with emotions, where emotions are pure. Essentially, we're talking about the 5 wisdom family emotions. Unadulterated, uncensored, anger, aggression, passion, jealousy, pride. And those emotions, uncensored, are wisdom. You might think aggression, that's bad, right? We should have peace. No. What's the matter with aggression? It's not the same as hostility. If you're tackling a problem with aggression, great. That means you're determined to do something about it. You're going to push through obstacles. What's the matter with aggression? That's going to get something done. So in the subtle realm, in the Sambhogakaya, we're really dealing with energies and emotions. And then the Nirmanakaya is where we get incarnated into the physical world. That's where we all live. We live in the Nirmanakaya. We have jobs, we go to work, we raise kids, you have grandchildren. We all live in this world where we're embodied. This is, we might say, so spirit gets stepped down from the purest experience of it to various denser forms. And if we were to think of this with other words, and we were to use 5 states, we could say there's the waking state, there's the dream body, the dreaming, there's a deep dreamless sleep, there's the witness state, and then there's a non-dual unity state. Why are we using all these different words to talk about something that we usually don't use a lot of words for? I think it's important. Let me give you an example, and now why stages and states become important. It used to be really confusing to me early on because you'd read about someone that was enlightened, but then their behavior didn't reflect that. We've had our share of scandals in our Zen tradition. And I'll just pick on, I don't mean to pick on anyone, but the one that comes to mind for me is Yasutani Roshi, who was a teacher of Maizumi Roshi. And from all my reading of him, he clearly had a Kensho enlightenment experience. He was very clear. He saw that spirit clearly. And yet, he was a right-wing nationalist and probably an anti-Semite. So you have to say, and you ask, well, how could someone have such a enlightenment experience and still be behaving in such a kind of regressive way? It's kind of puzzling. But if you look at it in terms of stages and states, you can actually make perfect sense out of this. Because anyone at any stage can have any state experience. In other words, you could be at an ethnocentric stage, like Yasutani Roshi probably was, and you could have a state experience of non-dual unity. But you would experience that spirit through the lens of the stage you were in. Let me give you another example. You have a Muslim who prays 5 times a day, and I spoke about this in Sesshin. Before the gym was built here, there was a big parking lot across the way there, and I used to watch this taxi cab driver. He would park his taxi cab there, and he'd get out and he'd take out his prayer rug and he'd pray. And I'd see him all day long because they pray 5 times a day. That's no small thing. Pray 5 times a day. And one day it was raining, so I invited him over here and said, "You can pray in the Zen Center." He came over. He's a really nice guy. So you could imagine someone being a Muslim that is kind of at an ethnocentric stage. Their tribe is important. Yeah, you could imagine that. And they could actually have a non-dual experience. They could be reading Rumi. They could have a non-dual experience. And if you have that experience of spirit, it is convincing. No one is going to talk you out of it. No one's going to be able to tell you that's not true. Even if you're crazy and you go to a therapist and they say the therapist tells you you're crazy, you're going to say, I don't trust you. I don't trust you. Because psychology doesn't really value the spirit. They don't really see it as important. It's not in most psychology doesn't. So the therapist is going to think the problem came from below when it actually is coming from above and something hasn't been integrated with the ego boundaries. Something has been inflated. But the therapist might not see that. So you could have a Muslim that's at ethnocentric stage that has the highest state experience of non-dual, sees God, essentially, and they would be so convinced by that experience of the spirit, there's no way you would talk them out of their ethnocentric stage because they're put together in their experience, they're one experience. So but that's how convincing spirit is. Am I making sense here? Yep. So it's useful to kind of have a map where we can see, spirit is a state. It doesn't change. It's given. It's always here. And I'd love to just do a facilitation with you about spirit, which we did in the sesshin. and then maybe we could have a little discussion. Is that maybe enough for today? There's just a lot here. What? What? Is that enough? Spirit is enough for one day? Yeah, I think so. So,
Depends upon the stage you're in.
huh?
Depends upon the stage you're in.
Yes, it does. Yeah, yeah. So, yes, it does.
Whether it's enough or not.
So, I'm going to use those 5. I don't make this more complicated than it is, but when I read about those 5 states in Ken Wilber, they feel a little dry to me, a little clinical. And when I think about them, and we did a big mind on this the last day of Sesshin, I changed it to 3 states of waking, soul, and spirit. And that had juice for me. If I think of that subtle energies or soul, I think of the Bodhisattva path. I think of Kanzeon. And that's alive for me, because that's an archetype that I'm familiar with. If I think of deep, dreamless sleep, I just have a hard time accessing that. But I can access soul as a metaphor, and that's very rich, and we don't really have time to go into that here, but another time. So I'm going to just use the 5 states right now, and we'll go through this briefly. So the first stage is waking state. So just notice that you look around and you see objects, tables, glasses, walls, people, coats, lights, right? This is our waking state. Our waking state is full of objects and things that we try not to bump into. And now you go to sleep every night and you dream, whether you remember your dreams or not, you do dream. It actually is important that we dream. When we dream, we're consolidating something from our the waking reality the day before. It's really important. They've done studies when people don't have REM sleep, they can't remember what they learned the day before. They can't recall it. Sleep is identified with intelligence parts of our brain. It's really important. So when you are sleeping, most likely all these objects don't show up in the same way. And if they do show up, they might show up in some exaggerated way that's kind of either scary or flying or something that it doesn't do in your waking reality. Most likely these objects don't show up so much. But notice in your sleep there's still some sense of I amness. I am in the dream. I'm still in the dream just like I'm in my waking reality. Do you get that? Okay. So what we're saying is dream is a little bit more subtle and less dense than our waking reality. And notice you think dream is really subtle. That word kind of is maybe not helpful because sometimes your dreams aren't subtle at all. They're wild and scary and you have really, really intense emotions in your dreams. Anyone not have a dream like that? Okay, so you with me? We're talking about the Sambhogakaya here. So now the third state of spirit is deep dreamless sleep. We also have deep dreamless sleep every night. This is harder to access because we don't remember it. But if we can look at it from brain waves, and we know that when we're in that state, it's also must be important. I'm not sure why, but it must be important that it's a kind of resting that we do. But in that state, we have 2 brain waves that come in deep dreamless sleep. One is a delta wave, which is characteristic of sleep. But we also have alpha waves, which is our brain waves we have when we're awake. So in some strange way in our brain, we're both asleep and dreaming and awake in a deep dreamless sleep. And I am still in that state in some way, though it's hard to access. It's more subtle, much more subtle. So it's harder for me to access it. And then we have witnessing, the fourth state of spirit. We're getting to a more subtle expression of spirit. I'll just take an exercise for a moment and close your eyes and think about yourself. Think of different characteristics about yourself, who you are. Do you have hair on your head? Do you have blue? What's the color of your eyes? How tall are you? How much do you weigh? What's your gender? How old are you? Where did you grow up? What's your religion? What's your favorite food? Color? What kind of music do you listen to? What's your favorite? What kind of movies do you watch? Just think of all the things you do that make up who you are. What food do you hate? What food do you like? Do you like red wine or white wine? Or both? Or do you drink beer instead? Or you don't drink at all? Did you have siblings? Where did you go to school? How far did you go in education? Did you go into university? What kind of degrees did you get? What career do you have? What's that like? All things that make up who you are. Now open your eyes. And I'd like you to notice that there was the self that you were contemplating just now, but there was two selves that showed up in this exercise. There had to be. There was one. The second self was the self that was witnessing what you were thinking about. Yeah? That's the witness. You could not have done this exercise without the witness. And you can't see the witness. So the witness is the seer. It's like your eyeballs. You don't see your eyeballs, but you see. We're seeing. The seer doesn't see itself, but the seer is always here. This is spirit, the witness. This is maybe what we speak of in the primers is the hub of awareness, watching the content. We've just raised this now to a higher metaphysical level, and this is important. This witness is who you really are. You may think you're all those things you just thought about, but we call that a case of mistaken identity. It's not unimportant, all those things that you thought about, but who you are in a deeper, truer sense is the witness. Can you see that? And don't you feel something relax in you as you see that? Don't you see something just kind of, I have to try so hard to be perfect. You are perfect as a witness. There's no improving on that. There is no self-improvement program for improving your witness. You can't have more of the witness. It's like emptiness, We often say emptiness is like, we have to use metaphors to speak about these things. So we say it's like the ocean and the waves. And you notice that in the ocean and waves, they're wet. Water is wet, but the waves don't have more wetness than the ocean. There's no characteristic in emptiness. It's not a concept. If it was a concept, it would immediately generate an opposite. So the experience of this witness is pure. This is who you are. And isn't that wonderful? Isn't this important to remember, see, appreciate? Doesn't it make a difference? This witness has been here, always been here. So then we have the final stage of non-dual unity of spirit. The highest state of spirit that any wisdom tradition can speak of. We have different words for it. It doesn't matter what we call it. So I want you to do this little, just be patient with me here. There's a lot of people in the room, so this may be a little harder to do. But I want you to look around and tell me how many heads you see in the room. And you're going to have to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. How many heads do you see in the room?
22.
22? I have to count again. 1, 2. 24.
25.
You see 25?
Heads.
Heads.
Well, you count your own head.
No, I can't see it.
So I see 24. Okay.
I'm just counting.
Huh?
I'm just counting.
Okay, but so Douglas Harding wrote a little book a long time ago. I met him at ZCOA. I was very excited when I met him. And he wrote a little book. He made this discovery on having no head, and he wrote a book about it called a little thin book called. He was a British guy. A little thin book called "On Having No Head," and he discovered that he had no head, just like you and me. We all have no head. So if you actually count the heads you see in the room, it's I think 24. But if you're in a small group and you ask people how many heads are in the room, if there's 5 people in the room, they'll say there's 5 heads. But actually, there's only 4. If you're being honest about what you see. You all with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want you to just look at an object in the room close by, the person in front of you. Just look at the person's head in front of you. I want you to, as you're looking at that, see if you can, with your awareness, just drop the witnessing of it, the sort of the watching of it, and just totally put yourself into that object in front of you. Be that object completely, 100%. And as you do this, I want you to notice that that object is actually sitting between your shoulders. So you are no longer in the room is in you. Do you see this? You see it? It's always here. There's no separation here. There's no you in the world. This is you. All of this. And the way Trungpa put it, which I always love, he said the sky is a blue pancake that plops down on the top of your head. That's a very good way to describe this experience. And we're talking about here the highest state of spirit, enlightenment, kensho, satori, whatever you want to call it, big mind. And we should approach this state with some reverence and respect. Because this is truly who we are. It's always been who you are. It was who you are before you were born, and it's who you are after you die. It doesn't exist in time. And all the wisdom traditions are speaking about this. And they're trying to get people to pay attention. Because we don't. We don't really value spirit in this culture very much. And if we learn about spirit, it's usually an expression of spirit that comes from one of the lower stages, like magical, mythical. And there's some really stupid metaphysical teaching, like The Secret or something. There's some hogwash about, if you think it, you can have it, or I don't know, some magical thinking. And any adult looking at that, and if they say, if that's what spirit's about, I don't want to have anything to do with it. That's hooey. So you have people in the scientific, rational stage saying, if that's what spirit's about, I don't want anything to do with it. God is dead. And they're right. I mean, if that's what spirit's about, it's silly. So we don't have a very sophisticated way of accessing spirit in our culture, and it's unfortunate because this is a huge. It's important. This makes a difference if you see who you really are in this way. This is who you are. When we speak about your true nature, your Buddha nature, we're speaking about this. And this is not abstract. This is not a theory. This is given. It's always been here. You can have it in a blink of an eye. Now, you might, hopefully, I hope you had a glimpse right now when we did this exercise, but it's a glimpse. It'll come and go. You won't necessarily, you'll forget this. So to have a clear and sustained access to our true nature in this way, we need to have a steady diet of meditation, prayer, contemplative practice, so that we can continually access this. Otherwise, we are easily distracted. So I think that's what I just did with that exercise of spirit, is talking about the same, is a way of accessing something really important experientially. And I did this through a kind of integral practice. And what's the matter with that? And now, when we talk about the absolute and the relative, we might have and especially if we went further and did a big mind, which we did in the retreat. Now if we go back and integrate this further and speak about in the first person as the waking self and soul, which is very juicy, and spirit, now we've got to me, the movement of spirit and soul is a huge, pretty much what the spiritual path is about. Spirit is refined and clear, and there's no doubt with spirit. Spirit is clean. But spirit tends to take everything to itself and be a little greedy, and then it becomes severe. And that can become a problem in the spiritual path. And when you awaken to spirit, you think you feel really happy because you think it's going to solve all your problems from now on. And somehow that doesn't seem to work out. It doesn't. So then you fall back into the world of soul. You fall in love with the world. Don't you? I hope you do. That's the Bodhisattva path. You fall in, that's the weakness of soul, is that we fall in love. Spirit doesn't appreciate imperfection. But in the world of our soul, we do. We love problems. Spirit is going up to the top of the mountain to have this big experience, but you can't reside there. You can't live there. You have to come back down and live in the valley where you can send your kids to good schools. Spirit tends to forget about the mundane world, forgets to feed the kids at breakfast. Soul doesn't do that. Soul is where we reside, in the valley. That's a huge part of the spiritual path. But notice, and I think it's helpful, that these are, while spirit and soul are counterweights to each other, they tend to correct the pathology of each. They each have soul can take itself too seriously. It can be too dramatic, too emotional. And so when soul remembers spirit, it can remember to be lifted up, to be lightened by spirit. And spirit rejects any kind of problem as a kind of virus in the system and just say, get out of here, I just don't want you around. You're ruining my practice. So they both have a kind of pathology, but they also balance each other. So you might think, and it's useful to realize that the soul part of spirit is just, it's part of spirit, but it's just slightly denser, a little denser. But it's not that spirit is the best because we go in this order. If you look at the 10 ox-herding pictures, the last picture is this guy going back into the marketplace with gift-bestowing hands. I think it's around the 8th ox-herding picture is just a circle. And that would be the expression of emptiness, or what we're talking here of this non-dual experience. But from the Zen point of view, that's not the end of the spiritual path. The end, actually, the bodhisattva path is the fruition going back into the world. And we could say that's the work of soul. And I think there's this movement between soul and spirit in our spiritual path. And when I use those words, it brings alive absolute and relative for me. It just gives it more juice. I can access that from my emotions in a way that I can't. Absolute and relative is kind of, I don't know, scholastic or something. It just doesn't have the juice for me. But soul does, and spirit does too. And I don't think I've ever used either one of these words much in the past, and it's only since I've started kind of wrestling with integral stuff that it's come up. So I think that's probably enough for one day, and we could have a little discussion. Yeah, Mark?
So, first of all, I love this. Thank you.
Oh.
I really love this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm feeling very emotional right now.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that emotion is that I'm stuck on heart.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't mention the word heart. And I just hear me out for a second. When I think of
Oh, I see. Yeah.
do I have to repeat myself? Yeah. Say what? Okay, I'm feeling emotional, and I'm thinking about heart. When I really when I think about soul, that's different from heart for me. Now, maybe this comes out of my being Jewish, where soul really meant, going to heaven, and the soul is going to. And so when you're talking soul, I'm thinking heart. And I want to know, does that work?
Why wouldn't it?
It does for me. Yeah.
We can get stuck with words. I'm not using soul in a metaphysical sense, as you just said. But I can see if you have a tradition where if you have a tradition where soul was used in that metaphysical sense that you just said, then it's not accessible for you. So replace it with heart. Replace it with the bodhisattva vow, and then it's alive for you. So it doesn't matter. We're talking about the experience and trying to use words which are inadequate in any case to express it.
The whole thing is very emotional.
That would be true in the Catholic tradition too. The soul
Yeah,
is the real-
I know. Now, I'm speaking about it psychologically, metaphorically, and I think it's useful if you're able to hold it in that way, that it's a big archetype that to me is very much alive. But if that doesn't work for you, just think of the bodhisattva path. It's the same idea.
Well, our friend Leonard G. Cohen comes to mind, because always in my mind. But the crack through which the light comes, that is soul. The cracked heart, very much heart. And the light is spirit. And you can't have one without the other.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you're saying. I've been reading Robert Wright, who talks about a non-zero sum game as a evolutionary process in human experience on the planet as becoming more complex. That's one of the qualities of life, that it's always becoming more complex. Is that also what you see in Ken Wilber's stages and states?
Yes, each stage is embracing more complexity. It's more inclusive. So if you go past there are integral stages that are now developing. Very few people in the population are really at that stage. But if we know the map and we know to look for it, we can move in towards that. And the one thing that we call it like first tier stages, second tier, third tier. And the integral stages, we would say, are third tier. And the big shift that happens when people get to that stage is now when they look back at the other stages, they don't devalue them in any way. They don't think that their stage is better. They actually can embrace and work with any of the stages where they're at. And that's a big shift. Because now, and they tend to have are really looking at the big picture, a sense of wholeness. So complexity is increasing, and the interesting thing is that we're always evolving as a culture, as a world. So those stages are always going to be moving and changing at the leading edge, wherever they're at. And hopefully, if we were thinking this in terms of integral spirituality, we would want to have the highest state experience of spirit and access to that. But we'd also want to evolve as far as we can in the stages so that we can have a larger embrace more complexity, be more compassionate, more flexible, and be able to work more skillfully with people that are different in different stages. And I think that's the key here, especially in terms of the Bodhisattva vow. We want to be able to have upaya so that we can work with that crazy uncle at Thanksgiving that shows up, everyone has one in the family.
Is there a name of that book by Ken Wilber?
There's probably 50 names. He's been prolific, and I have to read pieces of him and put him down. I can't take him too much. I was in Sesshin, so I read a lot, but I was in a state of samadhi, so I was able to do it. But generally speaking, he tires me out.
Too conceptual?
He's very Vajra, but I don't. So I think what happens is people often Ken students mistake the map for the territory, because his map is very complete. I think as a map, as far as maps go. But you can get stuck in the map easily trying to figure it out. And I don't think Ken does that. I think he actually sees the difference between the map and the territory. But I would suggest pick up a book and read it until you can't read it anymore, and then get another one. I generally jump around from his books. When I can't access something, and if I still want to read him, I'll pick up. I have most of his books, so I'll just pick up another one. Yeah.
I do very well with things like diagrams and maps, so I would be curious to see if there literally is a map of the stages.
Oh yeah, there is. If you look at Ken Wilber's books, he's got plenty of maps. He's got diagrams and maps and charts, and it to the nth degree too. He just wrote another one of his tombs, which is integral religion for
The future of religion.
The future of religion. It's a big, thick thing, and if you look at some of his books, he's in the appendix, or he's got charts galore. You would love it. You can go crazy. You can go crazy with those.
If you're looking for charts, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. Spiral dynamics. Spiral dynamics is kind of like what is not called, what is called otherwise Carol Graves.
Yes, Carol Graves.
And I was just reading a book by Don Beck, who Spiral Dynamics. And if you go online and look up, you can even find the charts of these spirals.
Okay. So I just want to say one last thing. I think this is all good, and I think it's also useful to kind of hold it lightly. In other words, it's something to use. We're not throwing out our Zen practice because there's now integral spirituality. Millennials might embrace that as their practice, but we have a very rich tradition already. But we could use aspects of spiritual theory and practice to enhance and enrich and make our own practice more relevant to the changing times, and that's what I'm suggesting. But I think you can get carried away with Ken Wilber too much too. I certainly have at times, try to pick everything apart. But I think to hold it lightly as just another piece of really important map and practice that we could use parts of in our Zen training and practice. Okay, thank you.